So this week on the 11th OVC, we're going to cover the common phrase I'm sure we've all heard of whoever saw a dead cavalryman. Where did it come from? Was it true? And yeah, we'll just start with that. So the phrase whoever saw a dead cavalryman, if you've been in living history, if you've been a historian, if you studied the Civil War, especially on the mounted arm of things, it's something you run across, and it's actually to the point where when we pass infantry reenactors, they say, here's your mule, and they always say, well, whoever saw a dead cavalryman? And of course, I'm like, never heard that one
Very
before.
funny, guys.
Very funny, guys. So what's your take on the phrase? Is it true? And kind of go from there.
My initial response would be, it depends on what year you really look at that.
Well, isn't that a cop-out answer? It depends on what year and what regiment and what location.
It is, but you'll notice I'm still sitting here talking to you, so I haven't left the conversation. Early war especially, I do not think, especially with the Army of the Potomac as a perfect example,
Right.
They did not know how to use cavalry forces appropriately. You're going to see it takes a lot longer. Many people are familiar with that whole idea that Southern cavalry are by far superior because they grew up with horses, they're using their own mounts, and many people up north, they're not going to be as well prepared to ride these horses and don't have the training and the background and the practice.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, you can equip large units, but they really don't know what they're doing. But they also were not put to use in the appropriate way. So in the first 2 years of the war especially, you see that there's no separate cavalry organization for the Union Army.
And this is something that you find all throughout the documents and all throughout the historical accounts of, it's almost a cliche now of the improper use of federal cavalry early on in the war.
Correct. So you're going to have individual cavalry units assigned to specific corps and various divisions and whatnot, but they're not acting independently. A lot of times they're going to be attached to headquarters, they're going to be escorting supplies, guarding the flanks, some scouting, but really not as much as you're going to see in the late war.
Exactly.
And so you're going to see the cavalry, and that's probably where the phrase originated. I haven't been able to actually track down
exactly. So I was going to
where
say,
that quote was.
We've actually tried looking in all of the places. When we looked on Research Arsenal, we keyword searched more than 30,000 pages of letters. We've looked in diaries and so trying to get the primary account of where that phrase came from. There's references to it
Multiple times.
Yeah, but as far as where did it start? Who was that instigator, the one funny guy that everyone was like, oh, that's hilarious, and they took it and ran with it. But we did narrow it down. Well, we couldn't narrow it down to who or what regiment, but we were able to narrow it down to a theater of war. Now, which theater of war?
That would be the Army of the Potomac.
Exactly. So for what we can find, and there was actually reference in one of the books we were looking at that said the phrase whoever saw a dead cavalryman originated in the Army of the Potomac. So did that change later in the war then?
It did. You're going to see that instead of being assigned to minor duties and flanking maneuvers and scouting and whatnot, no large engagements really, you are going to have a shift in how the Union cavalry operates. Basically, they start to operate independently of the main infantry corps, right, divisions and whatnot. So now you have the Union Cavalry Corps starting to be formed. And they get just enough extra leash from the leadership that they can start doing some things, and it starts to be relatively successful.
Yeah, actually, so this shift, and again, those of you who are cavalry historians and you know your stuff, this shift depends on how you argue the when, because you can start with the politicking versus when they actually did it. But let's say maybe spring, early 1863 to mid 1863, basically right before the Gettysburg Campaign, Brandy Station. Obviously, you have Chancellorsville going on, and that whole area there is this cloud of trying to reorganize the cavalry into the cavalry corps. So we'll just kind of say for this video, late winter, early spring, springish of 1863. They really started, reorganizing. And of course, Brandy Station is kind of where the cavalry corps kind of had their first major engagement.
Acting for the most part independently and getting bloodied, basically, and getting a little bit of a bloody nose both sides, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly.
A little bit.
So yeah, I guess go ahead and go into like the idea of cavalry now that they're reorganized. What does that allow them to do to then, I guess, take the stigma away of not really going into combat?
Well, Stephen, they start dying. I mean, that sounds terrible.
Yeah,
but,
I shouldn't have laughed.
But really, that's
what
basically
they did.
what happened. They have enough a leash from command that they can start doing their thing and trying new techniques, new practices. They're taking the enemy head on in the field. They're doing what we read in the manuals that cavalry are supposed to do and how they're tactically supposed to be employed, but maybe a little more aggressive.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there are some fierce clashes as the war continues, and they start having a little more success, and they're able to start to level the playing field fighting Southern horsemen. So I think it's a really important evolution in Union cavalry and how they're going to be used.
Exactly. And what's interesting is, like you said, later in the war is where you get all these references of cavalry just going to town, taking huge casualty numbers, hits, charging.
And not just with horses. There's a lot of dismounted cavalry fighting.
A lot of dismounted cavalry.
And it just sounds like a slugfest, like almost as intense as some of the epitome of infantry combat engagements.
Exactly.
Where you're going to have, you read all these accounts of, lead flying and trees falling down and, being cut through by all the amount of lead flying.
Well, actually, you have a reference with that.
I do. And we've been reading a lot of Eric Wittenberg, just because we're on a binge on reading up on cavalry stuff, and that's one of the newer books that are out, or several series.
The binging on Bob O'Neill, Wittenberg, and those are the two big ones right now, but yeah, for sure. Go ahead and what did you find in those books?
So yeah, the first reference that I came across that really struck me was a very graphic description of dismounted cavalry fighting at Hawes' Shop, just before the engagement at Cold Harbor. Mm-hmm. And you have a dismounted Confederate force and a dismounted Union force. They are just slugging it out in the underbrush, and it sounds like some of the most intense descriptions at infantry at Gettysburg and some of these major battles that you hear all these terrible descriptions of what's going on and battle swirling around you, and this really struck home with me.
So let's go ahead and listen to that account.
A perfect hell of fire and smoke broke from the rebel works, the 5th Michigan Sergeant James Henry Avery remembered. Even the air we breathed seemed thick with lead and sulfur. It did not seem possible for balls to fly thicker. The boughs were dropping constantly from the pines. He continued, the leaden messengers splished and spat and chuckled as they passed or struck the mark, burying themselves in a human target when fell all sides, some to rise no more, some to get up and stagger off to the rear, while others started for the rear with arms dangling helplessly, and then were overtaken and brought down again, perhaps forever. I never saw men fall so fast, and still the storm increased, and the surging lines wavered. And then there's another really small quote that I found shortly after one of the days fighting there. And it was a Union artilleryman. He is walking the battlefield at dusk, and he's just overwhelmed by the amount of dead cavalrymen all over. He says it right there.
Yeah.
Union artillerist Frank Wilkinson visited the battlefield as dusk fell. The number of dead cavalrymen strewn abundantly about struck him. The next quote that I have is at the end of Trevilian Station. Sheridan is describing some of the intense fighting. Yet again, it's still dismounted.
Right.
You're starting to move away from crazy cavalry saber charges, although they still did occur, but still intense fighting on foot. And he talks a little bit about how that was. And there's also a really nice description from a Georgia newspaper guy that is talking about how fierce the Union cavalry fought, but they had to withdraw, but they left a lot of their wounded and dead because they had to pull out real quick.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go ahead and listen to that one.
Writing years after the war, Sheridan quite correctly observed, this engagement, like that of the day before around Trevilian, was mostly fought dismounted by both sides. Indeed, they could hardly have been fought otherwise than on foot, as there was little chance for mounted fighting in eastern Virginia, the dense woods, the armament of both parties, and the practice of barricading making it impracticable to use the saber with anything like a large force. Roger Chew recalled, "This was a terrible fight. Indeed, I think it was as severe and destructive a fight as I ever saw." A Georgia newspaper grudgingly admitted, "The Yankees fought with a courage and determination worthy of a better cause. They charged our line again and again, but were repulsed every time, leaving their dead and wounded in a few steps of our line."
So with all that being said, I mean, obviously the whole point of covering this is the fact that obviously early war, basically our hypothesis, if you want to say that, for lack of a better word, is that the reason the joke was out there of whoever saw a dead cavalryman is because the cavalry wasn't used appropriately early on in the war.
Nobody let them be used.
No one let them be used. They were escorting wagons behind the lines. I mean, obviously they had them on the flanks, but they were just not. They were just in so many different battalions and divisions and different details.
They weren't really a cohesive force.
They really weren't. So early war, they weren't even allowed to fight. Mid-war, late war, based on those accounts that you just found, they were allowed to have hard-hitting charges, dismounted fighting, and therefore the phrase of whoever saw a dead cavalryman obviously changed. And you can look at the statistics. I mean, some of the, whether it's Trevilian, East Cavalry Field, Gettysburg, or rewind back to then, you had Brandy Station had, if I remember right, about 6-ish, 7-ish, 8-ish% casualties. Obviously, East Cavalry Field was in that same realm of 6 to 8% casualties. But then at Trevilian Station, you had 10 to 13 on the high end, 14% casualties, depending on how you run the numbers. But when you're in the teens or double digits of casualties, I mean, obviously you can't say that cavalry didn't fight and didn't, pull their weight as far as a combat arm of the army.
Yeah, it definitely has that fundamental change, and not even looking at troop numbers, looking at the horse numbers, the number of times that Sheridan and his cavalry corps went out on a raid, came back, and have to resupply, remount. They have to, they implemented a whole remounting structure in the Union Army because they needed horses so badly. And so that right there goes to show, it's not necessarily the same as human casualties, but if you are losing horses in combat through having to be captured, or just having them give out because of
wearing them out, you're still combat ineffective is the whole point.
Correct.
Yeah. And actually, those of you who you want to do some more research on your own, we strongly recommend, especially to the whole remount system. Bob O'Neill is doing great work, both on the research side of things, going to the archives, and in his writings as well, doing excellent work on the whole remount logistics behind the scenes. But good work behind there. Really. How would you conclude then the whole phrase of whoever saw a dead cavalryman?
Not true.
Not true.
Not true at all.
Ultimately not true.
I get the gist of the jibe, and I appreciate it, and it makes sense.
Good banter.
Yeah. Technically, if you want to look at it, that many cavalrymen died early war too. A lot of times it was disease, but
yeah, right, exactly.
Technically they did die.
Yeah.
So you probably would technically have seen them. But as far as the jibe, I think it doesn't really hold any weight once you start progressing past mid-war. I mean, really past Gettysburg, you can't say that at all.
For sure. No, I think we'll leave it there. So with that, whoever saw a dead cavalryman, if any one of you guys say that to us in the field, I'll stab you. That's
none of that.
Slightly threatening. All right. So appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a comment, see what you guys think. We're curious on what are your thoughts on that phrase, any other phrases that you would like us to kind of explore, especially on a deep dive of research. So,
or if you've come across any jibes, like witty banter between different branches, infantry, cavalry.
Yes.
Things like that. Maybe we can implement those back at you, and you can start yelling them at us at different events, or get stabbed.
Or get stabbed. Either way. Of course, until next time, ride hard. And didn't, pull their weight as far as a combat arm of the army.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely.
Yes.
I don't know what else to say to that.
I know, right?
Yes, I agree with your statistics.